One of the topics that has come up during the discussion is, and has also been discussed now, is issues of who owns the data, who has access to the data, who does not have access to the data, which leads us to this panel about access to knowledge. It's a great pleasure to have my friend, colleague, and co-author in a few privacy papers, Professor Niva Elkin-Koren from Haifa University Law Faculty, and Maya Adulamy. Maya is the Director of Special Projects, once again from the government, this time from the ICT Authority, which is located at this point under the Prime Minister's office. So, Niva, please.
Okay, so we talked in the, I think, previous session about, if you try to look at the big picture, we have three players in this arena, and that these are the subjects of data, the collectors of data, and those that Professor Zharsky called the data analytics, but that could be experts, and those could be the analyzers, either as individual experts, researchers in universities, or a company that could make sense of that data. And I think the previous session was looking at the relationship between the data subject and the collectors of information, whereas this session would look more into the relationship between the collectors of information and those who can process it and analyze it, either for funding or for informing policymakers. I haven't, unfortunately, couldn't attend the morning session, and I'm not sure to what extent you have discussed ownership at all, ownership of data. And since Miriam is not going to be here, I will have to substitute for her a little bit, even though this is not the topic that I meant to discuss. But I would like to argue that in data we rely less on ownership and more on possession. And that is because intellectual property law that would normally protect intangibles such as data provide only very limited protection to data, and so that raw data, and I believe that's what Miriam was supposed to cover, but raw data in and of itself would not normally be protected, definitely not under copyright law. A compilation of data could be protected if it's original in its selection or in the particular processing or definitions. It would be protected to a limited extent by neighboring rights in the European Union, but not in the US and Israel. And that would provide a rather limited protection in terms of ownership over the data or the database. And again, especially in the medical context, there is also the issue of data exclusivity with respect to pharmaceutical, for the pharmaceutical industry, but I'm not going to discuss that unless it would come up later on in the Q&A. What actually is more significant and therefore becomes more powerful is the possession of data and the ability to prevent others from accessing the data. Maccabi can actually hold on to the data and not share it not with the funders and not with anyone else, not for privacy issues, just for simply commercial issues, right? I mean, it's like for promoting commercial interests. And the use of this data, when it is possessed by a collector of information, either that collects it incidentally as part of the treatment of patients, or intentionally in order to generate new products, could be dealt with, and covered by other laws, such as trade secrets, right? That it is held as a trade secret, it is protected as trade secret. It is protected also technically, where you do not allow access to others. And in commercial settings, sometimes we see legal claims such as misappropriation, unjust enrichment, where someone is taking advantage of the investment that one player was making in collecting the information and processing it, and create benefits, commercial benefits from it, without sharing with the originator of that data. But I think the more intriguing questions would come up when the data is actually publicly available. It is not kept in secret, but still some players would like to collect it. And that is some of the questions that we see regarding the players that were disregarded in the previous session as those who collect medical or health-related data. But I would agree with Professor Jarsky in claiming that those players become very significant in generating health-related data and that could become a game changer in creating health policy. And I'd like to use as an example the collection of data on what seems to be publicly available data, that is social media. And social media becomes a source for collecting health-related data. I was just collecting a few examples, such as a big research that was using search engine queries in order to identify people that were later diagnosed with cancer before they even knew that they are going to have cancer, just by analyzing their search request. Or a study by Novartis that was tracking profiles on social media in order to better understand the reasons why people are switching drugs, and which also became something beneficial. Or I think the most striking example, in my opinion, was actually an announcement by an insurance company in the UK last month that they're going to rely on on social media in order to assess the risk of their subscribers. And so it's not as if you would think, well, if someone is going to get drunk, well, we know that he's more he's less of a risk averse. No, it's actually analyzing on a long term, whether people, for instance, are identifying a specific hour when they're going to meet their friends, rather than speaking generally about meeting them sometime, and just using those as reliable indicators in order to assess the risk associated with a person and determining the premium based on that risk. So we look at a very, very beneficial, important data that is publicly available, and I think there is a lesson to learn here about how possession over this data, even though it's publicly available, is being used without relying on any intellectual property in order to prevent others from analyzing and using this data and generating something that is commercially valuable from that data. And if you think about the studies, and here I talk about commercial studies, but also research that is done on social media, you can technically either do it by connecting or linking to the API, and that would normally be done through a contract, right? You'll have to sign up a contract that would determine your rights in doing that, or from the outside, and here is where it becomes interesting, by simply scraping the data that is publicly available and afterwards analyzing and generating the meaningful information. And with respect to this scraping, it turned out that social media platforms are actually relying on the terms of use in order to prevent this type of practice. And that is regardless of now we're not talking now about the interests of their users, right, or the privacy of the users. We are looking at their commercial interests. And so they rely on the terms of use that would normally include some sort of restriction on automated scraping, on automating data mining for commercial purposes or for any academic research. In the United States, by the way, if you access computer generated data in a way that exceeds the authorization, that could end up in a criminal offense. And in fact, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act in the United States was used against those who invade, so to speak, a computer simply by accessing data above what was explicitly authorized, or in contrast to what was explicitly authorized by the terms of use. And here, last July, there was actually a lawsuit by the American Civil Liberties Union in the United States, claiming that this law and the way it is applied by social media platforms to prevent access to data for the purpose of research is unconstitutional, as it conflicts with First Amendment, both of those of us who want to study it and those of us who want to generate the knowledge that it reflects. In Israel, by the way, there were very few cases related to scraping, but basically, of course, since the data itself is not protected, the few courts that were dealing with scraping were actually not treating it as an IP infringement, but were open to the theory that it may violate the contract if the contract explicitly restrict access or the exercise, the applying bots for scraping the data. But Israel, as opposed to the United States, has a very strong regime of standard form contracts, and I believe that under that legal regime, some of these terms in the terms of use that restrict this type of access to data may be also challenged. So what are the consequences for research? I would like to point out three consequences for research, and here again, I'm more concerned about public research, but also for public health purposes, but also for commercial research by companies and the leveling of the field that would open up the field for more studies and more research. So one issue is of course, the data divide, so that once the platforms, social media platforms, hold on to so much data that is so significant for policymaking of all sorts, health is just one of them, they can actually decide who is making research, under what circumstances, under what conditions, and they enjoy the exclusivity of doing the studies on the data, either by themselves or through their partners. They could also determine which research questions to ask. So it's a good question to ask, about discrimination of other platforms, but if you want to study discrimination on my platform, that's not a good research question. Or I think that those of us who are familiar with studies in the pharmaceutical industry know that that is partly the problem, right? And it's partly the problem also with respect to not just defining the research agenda, but also defining the publishing or the publication policy. So whether research results could or could not be published and shared with the public, that is something that is also subject to the discretion of the possession, to the extent that we leave that decision to the private sphere, and we treat it as simply a contractual issue that is not subject to any public or legal oversight. So I would argue that in this context, especially with major platforms that collect and hold on to large chunks of data. And when we talk about big data, we talk about big, not in the sense that one is holding on to the big data, but to the ability to generate big data from various sources and create this cumulative effect. I would argue that we need to consider regulation that would enable some level of access to data and some leveling of this playing field.
Thank you, Niva. Just two quick points. We tend to compare a lot to the United States because it's there and it's big and it's, they advance in many issues. Their level of privacy protection on the books is much lower than what we have here and what the Europeans have and probably what the Australians have. In practice, it might be something different for various other reasons, but that's why they have to find a resort in the Computer Fraud Act rather than privacy laws, because they have far less privacy laws, at least in the federal context.
Can I just quickly answer that? I think I disagree. I don't think that has anything to do with privacy. I think most of the cases that were brought under this law were actually protecting commercial interests, and it's proprietary. And I think the reason we look into the United States is not just because it's closer, in terms of our culture, and it's in English. It's because that is where the data industry is. So that's why it matters, because these are American. Most of them are American companies.
Yeah. Okay. Maya.
Yeah. I'll try to be quick so we can take our coffee break. My name is Maya, and thank you for inviting me, also because I'm currently on maternity leave, and this is a nice going back to adulthood.
Speak up, please.
Oh, yeah, sorry. So I work at the Prime Minister's office at the ICT Authority, but I'd like to start going 4 years back. I was working in a startup called Move It. It's a startup that does public transport. It uses crowdsourcing and basic public transportation information. At the time, we were a really small startup, 6 people working out of the garage like in the movies, and I was doing business development. And when we were trying to get the basic information that we needed to build the app, which was basically just where the bus stops are located and whether the bus routes and etc., we tried going to the Ministry of Transportation, and they kindly told us no. Go away, please. And then we had to go door by door to each public transport operator in Israel and get the information from them. We had a little bit of money already, and then we were able to do it. And the company is today worth about $500 million. It has 300 million users around the world and works in 60 countries. Shortly after that, I joined the government. And then...
Yeah.
No. I left way before the exit. I made a huge mistake. Yeah. Yeah. No, not really. It wasn't a mistake. No, so they didn't make the exit yet. So I joined the government, and then I said, listen, this is what we should be doing. We should be getting information to the startup ecosystem that works in Israel. Our friends from Australia, I don't know if you know, but Israel is second only to the Silicon Valley in the number of startups. I'm not talking per capita, I'm talking just total number of startups. We're second in the world. Yes, we are. Yeah. And if you look at, maybe some of you have heard of the book The Startup Nation. The author of that book did a follow-up research, and he said, well, the two things governments need to do to support the ecosystem, basically two things. One is the government needs to be a beta site for startups, so we need to allow startups to use our systems. And the second, and the more important one, is that we need to give startups access to our information. The government is a big brother. We hold a lot of information in many different areas, and the best cooperation we can incorporate with the industry would be to expose that information. So that's what we're trying to do. We take different types of data, public transport, weather data. I'll talk a little bit about medical data, even though that's not our focus. So weather data, budget data, education data, really tourism data, really different kinds of things. And we provide them using an API that anyone can access, and researchers use it, journalists use it, critics of the government use it, and startups use it. And then we can take that information and build cooperations with the industry. For example, earlier this year, we decided we want to do something about tourism in Israel. So we provided a huge data set of tourism, and then we had a hackathon that was funded by the Ministry of Tourism, and the minister, gave the awards and chose the winning apps. And we had, within days, we had 15 new tourism apps available in Israel. So this is one type of cooperation we can create this way. Now, going a little bit into medical data, we're talking, in my case, since we're talking about open APIs, we're only talking about anonymized data. Usually it's aggregated. Many times it's completely statistical and not really directly related to patients. And still, even in this case, we still have a few problems. I'll give you maybe a few examples. I've heard Watson being mentioned here a few times. So Watson can't really operate in Israel because our EMRs are in Hebrew, which means it's written right to left. Watson can't read it. So it's not really, we're not able to use Watson system type yet, but if we were able, our unique environment of EMRs, we are the only country in the world that I know of that has EMRs going back to the early 90s, right? Early 90s?
Yeah, but we are doing something with Watson, just to tell you.
Yeah, I heard you.
We have an agreement.
Yeah, I know. I heard you both. But like, from what I knew 3 years ago, when Watson were interested in coming to Israel and completely applying their system here in the general hospitals, they said, wait a minute, we can't do it, it's in Hebrew. So that was an issue. But I'll give you another example. Maybe some of you have heard of a startup called Palantir. It's the second largest startup in the world after Uber. What it does is big data analytics. They usually operate in the cyber and intelligence arena, but they also do things related to medical data, usually pro bono. And like a year and a half ago, there was a case here that people from the Ministry of Health would know better than me. Children in the Haifa district, the north district of Israel, were identified having smaller heads. And there was a theory that it might be related to cancer, related to dangerous factories located in that area. Air pollution, yeah. From specific factories. Now, no one knows yet exactly what happens there. But Palantir, what they wanted to do was they wanted to come here and take the data that we do have using those EMRs, and maybe finding out some connections. Now, it could have been connected to the pollution, but it could have been connected to completely other things. It could have been connected to people coming to Israel from the Soviet Union in the early 90s and maybe living next to the nuclear reactions. I have no idea. But they're able to take this type of data and then try to conclude different things from it. Now, the difficulties that we encounter, even though we're talking about completely anonymized data, we still have issues with it. And I'll give an example. If, for example, we took the northern district, and we were trying to divide it to areas, and there was a village with, say, 10,000 people only, and only 2 of them had cancer. And then we didn't aggregate the data high enough, so you could still somehow, if you lived in that village, find out that this person had this type of cancer. So this really prevented us from using the information, even though it was aggregated. Now, this is argument mostly about the level of aggregation, but it's still there, even though the data is aggregated. I'll give you maybe another example, not related directly to medical, car accidents. So we have statistical information regarding car accidents, where they happen, when they happen, who gets injured when, right? So it makes sense that if a certain road has more car accidents at certain times of the day, like at night, then Waze, for example, a lot of us use Waze, would tell us don't go through this road because it's more dangerous right now. But then when we wanted to take that information out about car accidents, again, completely statistical. No one knows who was in the accident, right? We were told, listen, no, but then you could cross-reference this with maybe an article from the newspaper that's saying a car of this type was hurt in this road, and then again, get to the person that was hurt. This is completely, this is really, part of the thing is that we are trying to take out a lot of information. We don't know how it's going to be used. We're trying to bring out as many data sets as we can, and part of the notion, I always say, I don't know what's going to come out of that data. I don't want to know what's going to come out of that data. I don't want to interfere. I want the industry to do it. I don't want to be involved. Like they can take, one startup in Israel took real estate data, combined it with education data, and then they told people these are the best neighborhoods to live in, not only because the prices are low, but also because the education is pretty good. So, and I couldn't have thought about that. No one in the government could have, right? It's only because the data was out there. So part of the problem that we want people to cross-reference different types of data also becomes a problem because they might in the future get to different. I know that face you're making. I always make it, but these are real arguments that we're having mostly with the legislators, or like you said, the strangulators.
But I think you have to realize that some of these are real issues, and I'll give you an example. A lot of the accidents in Israel happen because there are bad roads, and there are unfortunate people who live near bad roads. So it sounds really cool to say, oh, we'll just have Waze take you out of those roads. What happens if you live there? Does that absolve the government of fixing that road?
No.
No, you're saying no, but I'm again, this whole idea of, okay, combining
It should be
education.
public information.
Yes.
Exactly.
Okay.
No.
If you don't live there, you can
No,
go
right.
for a
No.
But then insurance company would take that and would say, well,
Exactly.
these people, this population.
But that has to
more
be
susceptible
regulated.
for-
Concerning
that's
insurance
right.
companies, should be regulated.
course.
No, so
But the
I'm saying-
information should be out there and should
Exactly.
be acted upon.
No, but I'm saying so long as there is no regulation that prevents these abuses, then it's still an issue. So I think, so it's easy to sit and say, oh, we could have all these wonderful things if there weren't any barriers. And I think we also need to think about why the barriers are there and to take them away, but in a way that's ethically appropriate.
First of
okay?
all, I wasn't trying to be dismissive of these difficulties. I have them myself. I mean, when I'm speaking about a certain data set, I also have thoughts about where I can take this and where this might go in the future. So I agree these are real concerns. Second, regarding what the government needs or does not need to do with the information, I think this can help the government make better decisions. A lot of the decisions made by the government today are not based on data. And that's part of the reason we're doing this. I'll give you another example on the real estate. A few years back, when there was a lot of talk about the real estate pricing, etc., we were trying to find, okay, how can we know what is the real rise? You have the data of the national statistics, but that wasn't accurate enough. And the solution was to use the data that the startup Madlan, the Israelis would know it, is using, that's based on tax authority information, right? So they're taking the information, the raw information, making it into nice apps that we can actually use on a map and everything. And then we can take that back as the government and use it. So this would be cost effective for us, not just because we're not developing it, but also because we can't think of the idea before it happens.
Questions, thoughts about making access? Okay, I think many of the questions have been asked throughout the discussion. There's some coffee, there should be, I don't know, maybe. Should be some coffee outside. We will reconvene at 15 minutes, please.
Thank you.